Thank you, Terry. Appreciate that. Good welcome. It's good to be with you again in Virginia, even with a low travel morning to get to Virginia. So Zoom is great for getting people together. I'm in South Carolina, by the way, in Chapin, which is a little community right outside of Columbia, right in the center of the state. It's hard to tell where Columbia ends and Irmo and Chapin begin. They all kind of blend together at this point in time. But I've really enjoyed times when we've been able to connect before with Terry and Mark and CBF of Virginia, and delighted to be with you today and the next three times, next three Thursdays. So I'll give you a little preview of that in just a moment. But thank you for being here. And what I'd like to do is first just show you where we're headed. And then I have a question to ask you all that might help us kind of get our minds and hearts flowing a little bit. Let me share my screen and show you where we're headed here. Here we go. I took the liberty to put one of the pictures from our backyard on the screen because that maple was just so bright and brilliant. It's probably about a week ago when I snapped that photo. It's even more red now and prettier. So it was just fun to include that this morning. But here's what I'd like us to do today. I have an inquiry for you in just a moment to ask you all, and then we'll look at locating ourselves in our faith story and do some contexting about our environment that we're in, big picture, and then church, what seems to be happening right now, and then move to, I'm calling it post-traumatic church growth. And by that, with the word growth, I mean all the various ways that we might grow as a result of moving through some fairly traumatic experiences, the pandemic being the most obvious, but many others combined with that as well. And I'd like us to have some good dialogue as we go along. We'll certainly have plenty of time for that towards the end, but I'll pause, and anytime you have a thought, just get my attention. But I'm going to stop sharing and ask you a question, which is, I think I had it on the PowerPoint here, so let me show it to you again, just so you can see it. Here we go. What's on your hearts and minds as leaders? And then with your people who are part of your church. And by that, I mean, what's primary in as you serve as a leader in your congregation? What's primary for you right now? Where do you find your attention going and your energy going and your focus or concern? What's central and primary for you? And then as you listen to the people in your church talk as well, what's really on their minds and on their hearts these days? So just take yourself off mute and share what's on your mind and heart as a leader, and then what do you hear your people sharing or saying?
In our case at Radford, it is reconnecting with families and reaching new families. The church had some complicated history in the last few years, but with our new pastor, we've begun to reestablish relationships with people who drifted away and had some new people come in. But even our own families have not really come back to church. They're saying that their lives are too busy to do anything other than join us on Facebook and YouTube. And when we talk about bringing things to their communities, we're, as you know, a network of towns around us. And we have as many people who live not in Radford as do live in Radford. And they're just saying it's hard either it's Sunday morning or Sunday night, but it's not both. And that is a perplexing thing for us to think about. How do we connect with children and families and begin to help those families grow spiritually.
Mm. Thank you, Ken. Great questions. Somebody else, where's your attention and energy going, and what's on your heart and mind as a leader, or the people in your church as you observe them?
You know, it like, oh, go ahead.
No, after you.
Sorry. Yeah, so we're all over the place, like so many other folks. There's definitely a communal grief that is taking place, but we're all doing it in our own very private ways. There's the great scattering has definitely happened with us. So on my end of things, there's a strong emphasis in leadership development with an awareness that we had not done a very good job with deeper levels of development up into the pandemic. And so when the pandemic hit, we didn't have the folks that we needed to kind of stand with staff and figure out how to navigate the congregation together. So there's a heavy emphasis right now on my end of things as pastor in leadership development, and then attempting to spend less time focusing on public space, like just anything public feels really hard right now, and trying to create more personal and even intimate space with folks. It feels like the relational stuff is going really well, and anything beyond a small circle of folks just gets really complicated for all kinds of reasons.
Mm. Thank you. I like that phrase, the great scattering. I had not heard that one, but very descriptive.
Go ahead, Chris.
What I was going to say, we're in the middle, well, not in the middle, we're coming up on the end now, thankfully, of a long-range planning process at First Baptist Bristol. And it has been freeing in some ways because there's been a lot of baggage that we've been able to drop and things we no longer have to carry because of the pandemic. But it's also difficult. How can you think about the future when you don't fully understand the present? And there's so much anxiety about the present. I mean, this is an older congregation. And so while we are growing younger and people are excited about that, you've got some older congregants that are just wondering, well, how are we gonna survive this thing? I mean, we're excited about the future, but we're worried about the present. And those two sort of seem to be in conflict with one another. And in trying to navigate that space is made for an interesting and difficult year. I mean, it's been hard doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's so much in what you just said. Being able to vision the future when the present is so uncertain and unsure, it creates quite a dilemma for us. Anybody else?
Mark, as a layperson in the church, the thing that I'm very aware of and what's on my heart is that there seem to be such conflicting understandings about the purpose and mission of the church. You know, what is God up to? What is God's desire for human beings, for faith communities? What is the gospel? There are such differing understandings of that, and as the culture has been folks in the culture have been pushed further and further to the ends of the pole, you can see those differing understandings of what it means to be church that are just bubbling up and creating incredible conflict in our churches, because those poles are vying for what the church is going to be in the future, even though we know deep down that that is not a vision for the future. That is nostalgia about the past. So it's a tough time dealing with this in-between time, knowing that something actually better is coming down the line, but we have to turn loose a lot of institutional think and really in some cases some very bad theology in order to face a future that is more Christ-centered.
Mm. Wow. Well, thank you. Some really good insights. Did anybody else want to share a thought? All right. I didn't include this in what I had prepared to share, but let me mention it. It's a statement I find myself saying, and I'm probably preaching to the choir. Perhaps I need to hear it more than anyone else. living in the way of Jesus is beautiful. Living in the way of Jesus is beautiful. That when we can clear the clutter and we can step out of the angst and we can lay aside our various concerns in our busyness with being church, and we can get to the pearl of great price or the treasure in the field, these analogies we would recognize. It's really a beautiful way to be in the world. It is life-giving. It is rich. It's deep. It's broad. It's significant. The world's transformation is there. The hope for the world's transformation is there. Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, parables of Jesus. If we could live into this way just a small percentage of the time, more than what we currently do, it would be transformational for our world. So while we are seeking to lead, while we are seeking to be God's church, it's good to remember there's something really good about this. It's a beautiful way to be in the world. Well, based on what you shared, and we'll come back to it and have plenty of time for sharing as we go along, let me introduce a few thoughts to us. In talking with Terry about this some time ago, the Emmaus Road walking came to mind from Luke. You'll remember this, and it's a long description, 35 verses. So I certainly don't want to read all of that to use our time for it today, because you know the story with those Emmaus Road walkers, and Jesus joins them as they're going. And as I reviewed it again recently, I noticed this phrase, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And it made me think about our churches these days, and that so much is swirling around us, and it's such a fluid environment, and we are distracted by many things, to quote another experience in the life of Jesus with Martha and Mary, distracted by many things. Sometimes we don't recognize where God's presence and movement is happening. And so if we're there, we're not the only ones. Here it is in Scripture as well. But then you remember those two disciples recognized him when he broke the bread. And then they make the statement about how their hearts were burning within them while they were walking with Jesus on the road. And he was explaining their faith, a life of faith to them. And then the result is immediately they got up. So they had this experience where they recognized Jesus, encountered Jesus, recognized him, and the immediate after effect was that same hour they got up and they headed back to Jerusalem. So this is where we aspire to go. This is where we want to get to. This is help ourselves and others be those who do recognize the presence of Christ in our life and in our world. And that then this leads us to get up and go where we need to go. So let's do a little contexting. And what I'll do is I'll talk through a few slides, and then I'll stop sharing and pause and give you all a chance to respond. And then we'll do that again and just go back and forth with that as we go along. So contexting here on the backside of a pandemic. I hope that's where we are. I did see a news report recently that since September 1st, the percentage of COVID cases that are arising each day has been shrinking. And I think I saw the statistic 50%, don't quote me on that, but that the percentage of new cases is dropping pretty rapidly. So we're very grateful and thankful for this. We still have a ways to go, obviously, and it depends on where you are. So there are lots of other nuances to it, but overall, there's some hope in that way. So let's just call it the backside of a pandemic and hope that that's true. Regardless of it, we are in a season of major change, transition, and upheaval. You all described this pretty well in what's on your heart and your hearts and minds as leaders, and listening to the people of your churches. You described this pretty well, that you described an environment that's in a season of major change and transition and upheaval. I don't know if you've seen this an acronym for VUCA or not. It came out of the War College back at the end of the Cold War. And then sort of went underground. It didn't really make it into the common language or usage, but has arisen in the last 5 or 6 years, even before the pandemic, the last 5 or 6 years, to describe the current context in our world. We thought back in 2000 to 2010 that the world was very fluid. And before that, we thought it was very fluid, but looking back, those times were pretty stable compared to what we've been experiencing. Not only the pandemic, but the political divisiveness, the issues that have arisen, race, environment, you name it. There's so many issues swirling that it seems like the world is increasingly a VUCA world: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. That these words describe the time we find ourselves in at this point in time. I'm starting to call this, I liked Sterling's phrase, the great scattering, because that describes pretty well what's happened in churches. Overall, big picture, I find myself using this phrase, the great reevaluation. And let me describe how I've gotten there. It was partly inspired by the great resignation. I mentioned my daughter earlier when it was just Terry and Mark and I coming on. I mentioned that we have a daughter who moved to Richmond recently, and we were talking while we were there, and she used this phrase, the great resignation. And I thought she made it up, but I looked and found Anthony Klotz from Texas A&M, who unfortunately beat the South Carolina Gamecocks in football last weekend. Nevertheless, he is an organizational psychologist there, and he started using this phrase just in his family's life. And then he started looking at the statistics. In the last 4 months, there have been record numbers of people resigning from their jobs. Record numbers of people resigning from their jobs across vocations. We have some friends where both of them are school teachers in high school. They're married to one another. They teach in the same school. They've been there for 15 years plus. But they were telling us that the school system is bleeding teachers right now. They're resigning left and right for various reasons. They're not resigning and going to another school. They're resigning, period, and leaving their jobs as school teachers. Our son is a third-year law student, so he did his internship this past summer. It's with one of the big corporate law firms. This one happened to be in Houston, but they're all over the US and big cities. And he said, I asked him about it. He said, Dad, they are bleeding lawyers and attorneys. It's a great firm, but they're just leaving right and left. And there's a vacuum of attorneys. And he said, for various reasons, they're leaving. And then I work with clergy and church staff all the time. So I'm keenly aware that many of them are leaving their positions as well, and know of one denomination, United Methodist in one state, that's really struggling to find enough clergy for the upcoming appointment season that they're facing. So at first, some people thought it was only clergy, because I did, because that was the world I was in, but I've learned, no, this is pervasive across vocations. It's not unique to any one vocation. And let me read you this quote that Dr. Klotz shared. From organizational research, we know that when human beings come into contact with death and illness in their lives, it causes them to take a step back and ask existential questions like, what gives me purpose and happiness in life? And does that match up with how I'm spending my right now? I like that phrase, how I'm spending my right now. So in many cases, these reflections will lead to life pivots. So this is a way to understand the great resignation that's taking place vocationally. But I would say the great resignation is a subset of the great reevaluation, because we've all come into contact with death and illness through the pandemic. We're reminded of our mortality, and life doesn't last forever. People are reevaluating their relationships with most everything. What we've just been talking about is vocationally. I've not seen research on personal relationships, though someone has probably done it already. I'm just not in touch with it, to evaluate what's happening in marriages and in families and in significant other relationships. I don't know about that, but I guess I would assume reevaluation is taking place there too. But we do need to include church here. People are reevaluating their relationship with everything in their lives, including their churches. So when we look at it this way, it helps us understand and get a frame of reference for this. And that's part of what is going on right now, is people are reevaluating their relationship with their church. So let me stop sharing for a moment and see where this might take you. If this is so, a great reevaluation is taking place, vocational reevaluation is part of that, and church doesn't escape. It's part of the same thing. What might that mean for us, or just where do you go with your thoughts and as your responses to that?
First, unfortunately, no surprises on that front, but digging deeper, at least in experience with lots of young adults and certainly even grown adults, there's a reevaluation of faith in Christ. The hyper association of church equals faith means that when church falls apart, it's just like, who am I as a person of faith? And I think that's something that is a blind spot for a lot of us, is addressing people's questioning faith, deconstruction of faith. Do we embrace it? What do we do with that? But in our experience, I think we had such a great thing going with community of faith. There's just a great vibe and vitality. The moment that community was not available to folks, it was almost as if Christ wasn't available to folks. Mm-hmm. There's an evaluation of relationship.
Yeah. So on the one side, I hear that on the one side, a great thing in that a community has embodied Christ and people have experienced that. But on the other side, it's got to be individually integrated as well. And the word deconstruction is very popular right now because it's another way to describe what's going through. And faith crisis is the phrase I was using for it before all this came along, where in our circle of experience, our faith explains enough of our experience that it makes sense to us. But then something happens outside of the circle and our faith has no way, we can't relate to it. And that brings on a faith crisis. And I think that's what's happened with the pandemic and all the other volatile stuff, is it's creating this need, this deconstruction is happening. All right, someone else, where you hear this great reevaluation and so on, where do you go?
Sort of piggyback on something that Terry said earlier. I think we're struggling from a lack of basic biblical literacy. I think people have been socially Christian, not necessarily authentically Christian, and have viewed Scripture as a way that is something that can transform their lives. And so now, when times are difficult, they're unsure of where to go or what to do. You see that everybody seems to be mad about everything, and they bring that anger and that fear and that frustration with them to church. And I was talking with a church member the other day, a leader in our congregation here, and I said, when I think back on the things that people have gotten upset with me about over the last 18 to 20 months, they're really upset with Scripture because I've pointed out something in the Bible and they have just really reacted strongly against that. And I'm somehow, making something up or saying things that aren't there. And it's just like, no, why don't you go read Isaiah or Amos or, any of the prophets in the Old Testament? That's most of that book. And you might be surprised by what's there. And so I think when you have these difficult times like what happens with a pandemic, and you factor in a lack of basic biblical literacy, then that only magnifies this questioning process and this inability to figure things out because people are realizing they didn't have the foundation that they thought they did.
Hmm. Yeah, a social connection, Chris said. That's another good phrase for it.
I think one of the dynamics at play here too, Mark, is the reality that much of the awakening that's happening is happening in the culture outside of the church. We saw this with the racial awakening and a lot of the things that are happening in the political world. And then folks outside the church are peeking into the church to say, there's hypocrisy inside there. There is an incongruence between what you say is the way of Jesus and the way you are choosing to pattern and live your lives. And those forces are coming from the outside. And I think the church has not been in a position to wrestle with that kind of truth telling coming from the outside because maybe we haven't had capacity to do the truth telling on the inside.
Mm. Wow, great observation. Almost every church we work with says they want more young people in their church. That they are looking for youth, young adults, so on. They want more young people. And I'm not sure they're prepared to talk like young people talk or to go to the places younger people want to go to, which is real conversation about what's happening in their lives and what's happening in the world around them. And does the gospel have anything to do with this? And so if you don't want to be challenged, don't invite any young people into your church because they're not going to just take whatever our traditionalism is not going to do it for them. They won't say if that's all it is, but they want something more significant.
And the rush to get back to some semblance of normal sends a powerful message to the world that we are totally disconnected from the reality of what is happening in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And our people don't want to hear that either.
Yeah. Well, I'll save a comment for just a moment, but anybody else want to comment before we move along here? These are great insights, very helpful. I think one of the questions, well, you said so much. It's clear from what you all have shared, there's really no going back. It's literally impossible to recreate a sustainable church paradigm that reflects 5 years ago. I think those churches will be around long term, but there'll just be fewer of them, and there are going to be other expressions of church rising up at the same time. But this need for reconnection, we're going to have to figure out how to address that. And let me give you just a very brief description of the way we're talking about it with people. And for us as church leaders, we want to take advantage of this change opportunity. People in our churches want to do that too. But there's also this desire for the familiar and for the normalcy. And I think that's natural and normal. We've been through the great shakeup in our world. And when things go crazy, think about any other crisis. When we go through a crisis, we have a hunger for stability and for normalcy. And I think that's just being a human being. There's nothing wrong with that. But the assumption is, for many people in church, the way we address our need for reconnection and for normalcy is to reproduce what we did before, to go back to what we did before. That's the way to address our need for reconnection. That's one way to address the need for reconnection and normalcy and familiarity. There are other ways to do it too. And I think this is an opportunity for us as leaders, is to say, what in our faith story and experience is enduring and is sustaining, that when a pandemic comes along, we're not going to lose it. It still is there because we've learned our faith practices and our rhythms. We can't always count on those. We used to go to a worship space on Sunday mornings, and we always did that, and we thought we would always be able to. We're not always able to do that. So if that's what anchors us in our faith, that's shaky ground. We have learned that shaky ground. And so here's what I would think, and this would be a great discussion for a church body to have. What is it for us that does not change, that we can count on no matter what happens in the world? And I would say, because I've had time to think about this, and it's number one, identity. We know who we are. We are disciples of Jesus Christ no matter what. That's our identity. Second, our companions. We know who we are with. We don't go to church, we are church. No matter where we are, even when the great scattering happens and we're all over the place, we're still church, because it's not a building, it's who we are as people. And then we know what we are to do, our mission. So identity, companions, and mission. We partner with God for the transformation of the world. We join God on mission in the world. However we want to say this, it doesn't matter what happens with the pandemic or other volatility, God's mission goes on. And so we can count on these things no matter what. The only question is, how do we embody that at this point in time? What's it look like for us for this season and for this time? And so that part changes, the embodiment, what it looks like, but the essence of our faith is still there. And so this would be a great time for churches to have those sort of conversations over Zoom or in person or however you can do it, of ask, what is it for us that's enduring and sustaining? And the hope is it can cut through some of what we were talking about, the social, simply being a social organization, that hopefully we can move towards being gathered around the way of Jesus a bit more. Well, any other comments, and we'll move forward here. Looks like Diana Farrell-White has joined us, so welcome to you.
It seems to me, Mark, that many of our churches are wrestling with the very first one of those, the identity piece. So I'm glad you bring that up, because the greater clarity we can have about who we are and what God is calling us to be and do in the world, the easier it is to face these difficult things. I think maybe the pandemic has helped usher in what Phyllis Tickle said was going to happen. You know, we are in the process of cleaning out the attic and getting clear about what's really most important. Getting those big rocks in there first is a huge piece of knowing what to throw out of the attic.
Right. Yeah. It's like the pandemic took the modern to postmodern shift and injected steroids into it, just ramped it up to a high degree. So it didn't create this big shift that's going on. It just exaggerates and amplifies it in an unmistakable sort of way. Fascinating. Okay, well, let's go a little further then. Contexting church. And I knew our time would go quickly, and so I'm watching it. But so we're not going to go in depth with this, but let me share this with you. And this, I'll show you a link. And by the way, I'm glad to send you this PowerPoint if you'd like it, partly because there's a link here to our YouTube site where there's a video about this that makes another great Christian formation activity in a church. Where this comes from is, oh, I know the other random thought I had when Terry was talking. When I first started doing this work back in 2004, we created a seminar that's no longer even relevant, but it was at the time. It was called Being First Baptist Church in a Non-First Baptist World. And the idea was there used to be a point in time when you could be, let's just insert any name, but First Baptist indicating kind of a traditional looking church in a community. And just by putting out your sign and just by being there, you would have people visit and join your church. And if you do a few good ministries, people would be there. But then all those people who understood like that way stood up and moved somewhere else, and other people came in and sat back down. And so being First Baptist, being an excellent example paradigm of a modern era church doesn't get the same response that it did even back before 2004. We're way beyond that now. But anyway, what this is the dynamics we are observing in many churches of many different denominations at this point in time. They are a strange mix, and you see the Venn diagram, and PowerPoint has limitations where all 5 of these circles are the same size, so you would think it's suggesting these 5 are there to the same degree, but they're not. It just depends on the church as to how much they are present. So let me invite you to think about your congregation right now. I'll describe them quickly, and then we'll debrief this a little bit. I mentioned the longing before, and we talked about that. There is a longing for reconnection that's within people. However they act on that, there's a longing for reconnection with the familiar, for safety and security, stability. It's not surprising. It's just there. In a VUCA world, it's not surprising this would be there. Longing is present among people in our congregations. Right alongside that is fear. And what I mean by fear is not concern. Concern is recognizing a situation that has some level of challenge, problem, or threat within it. Assessing this, deciding on a plan of action, taking action to address the threat, problem, or challenge within a situation. That's concern. We're moving, we're active, we are problem solving, we're moving forward with concern. Fear is something different, where it takes concern and it ratchets it up another level, another level, another level, to where emotional contagion happens in a group of people, among a community of people, and the emotion of fear becomes the primary lens through which they see most everything. Fear results in some paralysis. It results in reactionary decision-making. It results in emotional outbursts. This is what I'm talking about with fear. So there are churches that are not only concerned that all of this may bring member loss or institutional decline, some are afraid of that and making decisions out of fear, afraid of the rhythms of life, and they're afraid the social and political issues that are real and are divisive will tear their churches apart. So not just concern, but fear. So there's longing, there's fear in many congregations. There's grief. Someone mentioned that a moment ago. Every one of us has lost somebody to COVID, literally to death with COVID, but there have been so many other lower level griefs that are significant also. Loss of employment. There are people who are still employed, but they make a lot less money than they used to, because though they're employed, their jobs shrank. What's the right word for that? Their jobs don't produce as much income as they did before. So they're literally employed. They just are having to adjust down their budgets. Loss of opportunities. We mentioned gentleman who had to leave mentioned Radford University, that they have shrunk a little bit in their enrollment. There are lots of high schoolers who graduated, but they decided not to launch their college career and go off to an institution because they didn't want to just go and be online sitting in their dorm rooms. And I know some people like that who are sitting at home and not sure what they're going to do. So all these losses, and the normal reaction to loss for human beings is grief. So there, not to mention our familiar faith practices, there's some grief about that. So longing, fear, grief, and right alongside that, we wouldn't normally put these together, but right alongside that, we do need to celebrate. Our churches have done amazing things. When we think about it, though everything is deconstructing, though it is a great reevaluation time, though we are refining everything, churches have adapted in some wonderful sorts of ways. Remember when we thought we could not do worship online? That would be way too expensive. We don't have the technology. We don't have the skills. We don't have the ability. All these reasons why we thought we couldn't do it. And lo and behold, in 3 days, we learned how to do it. We were worshiping online. So that's amazing adaptation and innovation. And this says we can do it. When we are pushed and we have to, we can do this. So that's there. It literally has happened. And that's only one. We could identify many, many, many adaptations that we have done in the last year and a half. So we want to celebrate that. And for some, they've gotten a taste of this and they don't want to stop. It has been invigorating to them. And this leads to the fifth one, vitality, which is hard to define. If you had to give a definition, it's easier to describe. When you experience it, you know it. When you're a part of a church where there's vitality, and sometimes it's just a few individuals, sometimes it's a few pockets or a few groups. Once in a while, it's the entire congregation. But there's a sense of, there's energy, there's momentum, there's eagerness, there's hope. I like Brian McLaren's phrase, alive in the adventure of Jesus. I think that captures it for me, that when we can get there, the way of Jesus is beautiful. Another way to say it, there's a vitality. So for some people in churches, this adaptation and innovation we've done has been like Holy Spirit wind that's blown across the dormant coals and blown the ash off, and they're starting to fire up again. The Emmaus road walkers, that it's burning within them. They've gotten a taste of it and found that God is good when they get a taste of this. And they're eager for how else might we take shape? What's that look like? So I would call that vitality. So here we are back with this Venn diagram, these 5 again. What I want to ask you is, in your church, do you see all these? And is one more present than another? And maybe you have an example of one or the other, and just let's respond a little bit to this. And an activity for a church is, in their conversation, to rank these. What do you see at 1 through 5 if you had to rank them most present to least present, or if the circles were enlarged or shrunk in size to communicate the measure of each one of these in our church? How would you describe it? This can make for really substantive conversation for church. So here's the debriefing slide. Reflect on your congregation, which is most present, least present. What might this suggest to us as congregational leaders? So let me go back, let you look at it again, and then I'll take us off share and just let you respond. All right, where does it take you when you see this? And by the way, this is not an exhaustive list. There are other dynamics in churches too. So you might identify another one that's not here. These are just common ones that our team has happened to see along the way.
I think one of the challenges right now is when you say, our people, it's like figuring out who our people are. So it's interesting. It's like it lends itself toward my my inability to focus with my ADDs. Like at any given moment, you're in a grief space to a vitality space, like on a dime, depending on who you're with. So with our staff, I wish it was a place that felt much more like vitality, but I think we're stuck in the whole grief and fear thing and the longing, which are very prevalent along with our older membership. But then there's a growing group of individuals, some of which are staff and some of the others as well, but for the most part, it's a totally different group. And they're in that vitality adaptation space. And it's exciting. It feels adventurous. But there is no consistent, like, this is where this is the easy number 5. This is the obvious number 1 for us. It's just hard to gauge where people are.
Yeah.
We're not together that much. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's all prevalent. It's all there. And I think we could rate them depending on which group we're with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And these are 5 we would not normally put together. And I think that's part of the conundrum of this is it's not a culture we recognize or that any of us have experienced before, because it seems like, how can adaptation and vitality be present in a church while also grief and longing and fear are present in churches? And so I hope, well, let me hold a few more comments. Go ahead. Anybody else with a thought?
The thing that I see at play in a powerful way is the folks who are beginning to see that we can now have conversations about hard things and have it inside church. There are pockets in the church that say, wait a minute, we are fearful of those conversations. So that's inspiring a lot more grief and fear and worry on their parts, because in their minds, you can't have a conversation about race in church because that's going to divide people. Or you can't have a conversation about LGBTQ in church because that's going to divide people. Whereas on the other side, it's giving vitality and life to those who finally realize we're in a context where we can talk about this at church.
Thank you.
To kind of pick up a little on what Sterling said, I think it really depends. One of the things of who you're talking to, one of the things I've noticed is the groups that seem to be handling things better are of certain generations. And, you know, I would have thought, if you would have asked me at the beginning of this pandemic, with all of the changes that have been forced on us, which group in the church would really struggle the most, I would have thought it would have been senior adults, particularly with all the doing worship online and all of the sort of technical shifts that we've had to do. And they are rock solid. They are bought in. They are committed. Young adults here, they're staying at home because their kids can't be vaccinated, which I have small children. Mine can't be vaccinated either. I get that. But I regularly have conversations with them, and they're bought in, they're locked in. It's sort of your late generation X and your late generation X, or late boomers, early generation X, sort of that generation, that age group of folks are the ones that just really seem to be struggling here. And I've talked with other friends of mine who serve in other congregations, and they're noticing the same thing. And so what we're seeing is really kind of falling along generational lines, and that makes it really confusing because you have these two groups. You need to keep your senior adults happy because they're the ones that tithe, right? And you need to bring in new families because everybody wants young families to come in, right? And those two groups are good. And it's the group that you thought would be okay, that would have some sort of technical facility where they would be okay with this. And those are the people that, if I'm dealing with complaints or there are people that are upset, it is consistently people from that age bracket. And I don't know why. I'm not really sure what to do with that. And I don't know if it's just that they're processing grief differently, but it has been really confusing and interesting, I guess, at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris. Well, and I just saw the welcome to Diana to Virginia. Where?
I'm sorry. I thought I was sending that just to Terry.
That's okay.
Are you at Radford? Is that where you are
I
now?
am. And I think Kent might have been on the call earlier.
Yeah,
I
he
had to
said
take
you
a
were
kid to the
coming.
doctor and I just found out she has Lyme's disease. So I'm like, OMG.
Wow. Wow.
But now
Well,
she's on the tablet for the rest of the day. So she's happy.
welcome.
Thank you.
One of our kids had Lyme disease when she was 9 and she's 25 now. So it's likely she'll be fine.
Yeah, she's 9. So I'm going to tell her that exact narrative in a minute.
Yes. People have moved through this before. Yeah. But it is concerning. So
Yes.
glad you're able to be here. Well, let's think about then where to from here. Oh, and I'll send you this because I mentioned we have a video on YouTube that is these 5 dynamics. And it's been viewed a lot because what we found is a bunch of churches have used this as a Christian formation activity where they have online, in person, however they do it, where they watch the video together, then they debrief it. And I think part of the beauty of it is it shares, not all of us have had the same experience during this pandemic, and that we are at different places in our relationship to church and to life. And we are still part of the same congregation. And so it's not a time where uniformity of experience is going to accurately describe where we are, but we have all of these different experiences. While at the same time, so it's a good way to help people debrief what's happening and acknowledge what's in their church. And you notice, I hope in the way that you saw it, there's no judgment about the longing, the fear, and the grief, that they are just part of the mix right now. And I think by acknowledging them, we're probably more likely to take helpful action in relationship to them, just like we acknowledge the adaptation and the vitality. So it's a good Christian formation activity and church planning activity as well. I know lots of lay leadership teams have used it in their retreats along the way. So let me introduce just one more thing with our time. And one thought, and then we're going to get together 3 more times after this to advance where we go from here. Post-traumatic growth is a phrase that I did not invent, but it's been an area of inquiry and research that's been around for, I don't know, maybe 30 years now. It's not as recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, but it comes from a similar body of clinical research. And we understand what it means just by seeing the words. So I want to suggest to us that this is the opportunity for us. And by the way, you might remember with the Chinese character for crisis, you know how I think it's Mandarin is formed with symbols rather than an alphabet, and that the symbol for crisis is 2 other symbols put together, merged into one. And the 2 symbols are danger and opportunity. And so right now, with this crisis, we're all experiencing, it's turned into a chronic, ongoing crisis. There is danger that's real. It's not imagined. There is real danger, and there's opportunity. And so what we hope to do and aspire to do is invite and encourage and lead our people into choosing a growth mindset. That we as human beings have been given a gift by God, which is the ability to choose how we will respond to what comes our way. We don't always get to choose the circumstances of our lives. We are oftentimes handed things, like a pandemic, like a VUCA world. But we do get to choose how we're going to respond. to that. And I hope that disciples of Jesus Christ are always asking, where are you, O God, in this life experience? How are you showing up here? What's your guidance for us here? Where do we go from here? What's this mean for us as the body of Christ and as Christian disciples in this moment? That's choosing a growth mindset. So let me describe it a little bit, and we'll have a little more time for conversation. I've got to read a couple things on here. Knowing there are many ways to respond to life disruption, we choose to partner with God toward bringing good from every circumstance, setting our intention toward growth. I certainly don't believe that God brought the pandemic into the world, as some Christian leaders or teachers may teach. I do believe God is actively working to bring good from the pandemic and all the other volatility that's there. At the same time, God doesn't force us into that, but invites us to be co-creators of a new reality and a new present and future. And so that's how I would interpret Romans 8:28, and probably sounds very familiar to the rest of you. Experience is not what happens to a person, it's what a person does with what happens. So we, in this way, are not victims of the pandemic. We can choose to be people who are moving forward in mission and ministry with those who have the eyes to see and ears to hear. Let me mention this analogy, and this might help. On the left side of the screen, we do a lot of coaching with clergy, and I've done a lot of coaching in recent years with clergy who are moving from one church to another, where the new church they move to has more opportunity and responsibility in it. Oftentimes they are numerically larger, though not necessarily numerically larger. They are different contexts where their role, the role of the pastor, is different than the role that the pastor came from, to a different church, maybe bigger, maybe part of it, or maybe not, but it's just a different role, and they need to function in a different way to be effective as a pastor in this new call where they find themselves. Oftentimes, early on, they will feel like they will wonder why this church called them there, because they feel so incompetent in what they're doing. I'm not competent enough to do that. God in this church. So what happens is they find themselves with greater responsibility, greater opportunity. They feel like a fish out of water. They're not convinced they are competent enough to serve effectively in this church. And they feel like imposters. If the church only knew what I was saying to myself on the inside, they would get rid of me right away if they only knew this. And so you can see, if the pastor stays there with that mindset, she or he will undermine themselves and live into a self-fulfilling prophecy, and things will not go well. There are other reasons why things cannot go well, but this is a pastor's part of it. And so what we discovered through coaching is they have to enlarge or redefine, deconstruct and reconstruct their self-perception as a pastoral leader. They have to understand themselves differently. And one of the statements that helps them get there, you see on the left side of the screen. 2, God in this church called me, so I will trust their discernment. So you can see that's a step. It's not all the way to where you want to get to, but it's a step, because now the pastor is saying to herself or himself, well, at least this church trusts me enough to call me. And at least this church thinks I can do it. So I'm going to trust their spiritual discernment. And I believe God's in a call process. So God trusts me enough to call me to this place, God and this church. So even though I'm not convinced I'm competent enough to do it, I'm going to lean on their discernment for now and trust their discernment. There's some more steps to this, but you can see it's a progression of moving from I'm not competent enough to look at the evidence. God called me, the church called me, I'm going to trust that for now. That's part of what we want churches to do during this time is to recognize God is equipping them. God does equip churches to do what they need to do. If I didn't believe that, I would certainly not be doing this work, but I believe God provides for God's people what we need to do what God calls us to do. Not necessarily what we want to do, but what God calls us to do. And here's the progression of church perception as opposed to self-perception. We can't adjust to this new world. We don't have the capacity to do that. It's overwhelming and too much for us to move to. Looking back, the evidence shows we've adapted in tremendous ways. We've done some excellent innovating already. This has not taken us out. It has not destroyed us as a church. We've done some great innovating. We got a ways to go, but look at what we've done already. The evidence shows we can fill in the blank. So this means we are the kind of church who, and then let them fill in the blank. We're the kind of church who knows how to rise to the occasion, who can adapt when we have to, who is not so bound by traditionalism that we won't try new things. Imagine if that's one of the outcomes, the self-perception, new belief statements that a church could say. Look at what we've done. We adapted to this pandemic and we continued forward. It did not destroy us. That means we are a church who knows how to make the changes we need to make. If that becomes a part of our self-perception, that's liberating and empowering. I'm going to move over this. Choosing a growth mindset leads us to a growth-oriented mindset and spiritual posture. So all of this, we want to get to a place where we as people of God in local bodies of Christ have this posture, open hands, open arms, looking forward to God and one another. Where can we go with this? And that's with this last bullet, we avoid snapping back to previous level of functioning. Let me say one thing about that. Here's some ways, some research. If you want to learn more about this, we won't talk about it right now. So let me go back to the snapback idea. We talked about this desire of churches to snap back to doing exactly what we were before. And I think snapback church is probably a good phrase because people understand what that means right away. It cuts through some stuff and they get it right quick. Snapback church. That we want to get to a growth-oriented mindset, looking for where is God, where's the transformation opportunity here, what's coming before us. When we can get there, that cuts down on that desire to return to what was before. And I would say, as someone who's been working with churches for a long time, before the pandemic, almost every church I know was contacting us asking, how can we adapt? How can we innovate? How can we be vitalized as a church? They had never heard about a pandemic. And they were already asking, we see our numbers doing this. We see institutional metrics doing this. We need some help with adapting. So I'm thinking, do we really want to snap back to that world? That was the world we were in before this ever came along. Do we want to reproduce that and go back to the landscape didn't look that good. It was familiar, but it was not necessarily life-giving. So I don't know that I want to go, and this provides us a great opportunity to look for where can we go from here? What's the opportunity for us? So choosing a growth mindset and inviting our people to be in a growth-oriented mindset, I think it's one of the primary things that we can do. And so I hope by identifying some of these things, the context of the big picture, the context in churches, and then asking, what do Christian disciples do when this is the case? We get to choose the questions we want to ask as leaders. That's one of the gifts we get. We get to choose the questions. So what do Christian disciples do when they are in a situation like this? Let's together pursue those answers together as a body of Christ. All right, I'm going on because in some ways this part is very exciting. I think when we can get there, it's invigorating and exciting, and it's where we want to get to. But let me be quiet and let's just have some time for response, reaction, dialogues. If I had a great question to ask you that would prompt some really good dialogue, I would ask it, but I can't think of what it is right now. So let's just open up the floor and talk about whatever we need to talk about.
Mark Hughes, did you want to ask your question out loud?
Yeah, I'll just mention it. It was bouncing off the earlier conversation about late boomers and early Gen X group, of which I'm a part, right at the boundary as a 1969 baby. We grew up in a context of church that was very focused on gatherings and programs and fun events that kind of highlighted the spiritual formation that we had in a group setting. And for many folks, I've got someone who's roughly 8 or so years older than I am here at the church, who desperately wants us to restart some of the things that we had before we had to shut things down. And I've tried to gently remind him those weren't really working before we shut them down. So just restarting them is not going to be some magic pill. But maybe we can figure out some other ways of helping folks connect. The class that I led that has had trouble restarting was of 20 and 30 somethings. And many of them had church adjacent backgrounds, not really church central backgrounds. And this opportunity to worship from home or just to choose to worship whenever, because we record our services and if Sunday morning doesn't work, I'll watch it this afternoon. They have really fallen back into the things that are their focus. Family time, travel, and things that make the most memory for them. And I've been struggling being trained classically in how church worked 25 years ago, plus, of how to transition my own skills to reach folks who are not that much younger than I am by numbers, but mentally, generationally, far and away different from the way my brain has worked and what the patterns that I learned growing up. So just trying to figure out different ways to help people reconnect to church in meaningful ways that may not include their returning to Sunday morning worship in person, or even gathering for Sunday school classes on Sundays.
Yeah, thank you for describing that, because to our church brains that have been acculturated over the last, for me, 58 years into how you do church, it's mind-blowing. And it's outside of our paradigmatic understanding. I have a colleague in Pinnacle who describes those programs that you mentioned before the pandemic came along as that their church has many programs that are just good enough to remain operational, but they take so much energy and are draining, and takes the staff's energy to prop up and to keep rolling, and they don't produce very much. So that's the world we were in before this came along.
Yeah.
And so there are these things rising up, like that we'll talk about in the next few sessions. Digital disciples. There are some churches who now have created a category in their official church structure. First Baptist of Greenville, South Carolina, now has a category called digital members. you can join their church as a digital member and not live in that community. And that's why they created that. We worked with a church in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and another one in North Carolina. That this was 6 months into the pandemic, where people from other states were asking, "Can we join your church?" And their answer was, "We don't know. We've never been asked that question before. We don't know what to do with it." And so it raises questions like, what does it? I think the basic one is, what does it mean to be a part of this body of Christ? What do we believe it means to be a part of this body of Christ? And that's a great discussion for our people to have together. What does it mean for us to be a part of this body of Christ? And I'll give you an activity in just a moment, and if not, we'll save it till next time when we're together, a way to sort some of that. I see Diana has a hand up. Yes, ma'am.
I'm trying to avoid the, trying to guess when the conversation is going to be a good time to pop in. One thing that excites me about these 4 weeks, and why I've psychotically put it on staff calendar with the description and the reminder every week, is that we have had the Holy Spirit slip a wild idea in our brains in the past 2 weeks that we have immediately begun to wrestle with, and I am scared to death to take this to the older generations. And
do tell.
Well, and my idea is, okay, I think lots of us have giant buildings. I see Chris Aaron on here. I was just in a meeting with you, and giant building. I don't know.
Huge building.
In fact,
yes.
I almost didn't take this job because I saw pictures of giant building, and I came from small building, 2 different locations, one being a coffee shop, and that was oxygen. So we had this lady start attending our church out of the blue, who was the new CEO. Well, first of all, she used to be the CEO of Catholic Charities in Roanoke, which, if you know anything about power people in the state, well, they fired her because she got a divorce. But she's been at our church and thinks she's going to join. Coming back home to Baptist life after a generation in Catholicism, and she is the new CEO of New River Community Action. So she is the head of like everything that happens in the city. And she was saying our rent's really high. And I'm like, would you consider moving? Yeah, why? Spinning wheels, Sunday school rooms that will probably never reopen, basement that hasn't been used since the late 90s. And I and Kent, and we've started kind of poking this at other people, are like, we're going to invite New River Community Action, which is a regional group, to be in our building. And I am more excited than I've ever been about anything. But I'm really afraid of people saying, those are our Sunday school rooms. Where will the children meet? What if we have a new adult class?
Yeah.
The fear is so real in my heart, but my excitement, I think, is higher. So we're probably going to each week be updating drama.
Well, congratulations. This is really cool that this has come along. And
we need a lot of prayer. But they visited us, they talked to the board, we visited them to see what their office space is. We've started in wild imagination.
Well, let me offer a couple ideas, and then I bet other people have experience with this that they might offer that could be helpful to you. The couple ideas I would think of is, for most churches, it's stewardship season. Stewardship means stewarding our assets well.
Right.
So that can be a good theological frame. Is we've not thought of our church campus as an asset before, but it is. God has entrusted us with it. So let's be good stewards of that. And then the other is that there are a whole bunch of churches around various places who have already done this sort of thing. And so you can find some good examples. Peachtree Baptist in Atlanta, I don't know about now, but I know some years ago, they own like a whole city block, and they have rented out all their facilities, and their church budget has no facility costs now. The only costs in their church budget are ministry and personnel. That's it. And then the rent pays for everything else. And so I think changing the mindset, what your fear that you're describing is recognizing the mindset has been church is single-use building, single-use. Maybe multi-use building might be a good phrase to just start slipping in whenever you can. Multi-use buildings and assets.
Share
and that
space
sort of
is what
thing.
we like.
Shared space. Other people have thoughts that might help, Diana?
Expanding your mission and ministry in the community.
I was going to say, we've been having a lot of those conversations, Diana, as part of our long range planning process. And the phrase that I've used repeatedly is the stewardship of space.
Okay.
God has gifted us with a massive building,
Right.
and we've not been good stewards of it because we have a lot of space that sits vacant for a large part of the week. And so what we have tried to do is think about needs in our community, the things that we feel like are pressing needs that nobody's really doing, and trying to partner with those organizations. So, for example, there is a lack of mental health providers in this area, especially those that work with children and families. And so we have not found anybody yet, but one of the things we're looking at is, housing and counseling practice that specifically works with children and families, and partnering with a local college that has a school of social work to do what we can to better support children and families in this community, whether they go to church here or not. But yeah, we've been having a lot of those conversations, and I will admit people were hesitant at first, but I told people that our building or our sanctuary is over 100 years old, and the older the building gets, the more expensive it's going to be to maintain. Like, what a gift would it be, not only now but for future generations, if more ties could go towards missions and ministries because we were being better stewards of our space. And when it becomes a financial thing, the people that would normally complain are, oh, well, that makes sense dollar wise, so I'm okay with it. And so that's been helpful for us.
Yeah. Even better, Chris, if they could realize the need to do it because it's the right thing to do,
That,
not just because it's bringing money in the coffers.
I agree. I mean, that would be preferable, but
yes, it would.
that doesn't always work.
I know.
I do want to mention something to sort of go back to the Gen X boomer thing, and I think it was Mark that posted something about programmatic participation is faithfulness, and the inability to do that means like people are losing their faith. And I think that I have observed that. I think that is, I think there's a lot of truth to that. What I have heard from other generations, whether they are senior adults or who are worried about their health, or younger adults who are worried about the health of their children, is this rush to come back and resume these programs, even though we all know they weren't working that great to start with. They view it as a sign of selfishness because people are more worried about what they like than the health and well-being of people that they call brothers and sisters in church. And I think that this pandemic has highlighted those generational fault lines, and young families with small children who are worried about the health of their kids who can't be vaccinated, and senior adults who are worried about their own health are actually on the same side on this particular issue, at least here. And it's the folks that you think would be okay who are upset and are wanting to return to these things. And so navigating that sort of generational conflict has been stressful and headache inducing. And I freely admit I have young children. I'm on the same side as the young families with small children and the senior adults that are worried about their health. And I don't hide that. I mean, my daughter is 3. She runs up in the middle of the service and comes and climbs up in my lap almost every week during the offertory, before the children's moment. And so people know that, I mean, whether you're a member or not, if it's the first time you visit First Baptist Bristol, you're going to see my daughter run up and come and climb in my lap. So you're going to know, oh, that's the pastor's kid. You know what I mean? And so I get that people need, or they think they need that sort of programming, even though they won't admit that it wasn't that effective. But how to navigate that generational conflict with what one group thinks that they quote unquote need, that other generations view as selfish, that's a hard place to be.
Yeah, let me offer one thought. And this is a great conversation. And though I see we're moving towards our time, that in the Shift book that I wrote, that I did a presentation with Terry, CBF, we talk about a rule of life, or you can change it to a rhythm of life, if you like. I think that's one of the places churches can get great traction, is to talk about, what do we aspire to here? What are we trying to, what are our practices for turning ourselves into disciples of Jesus? What do we believe is a healthy pathway to help us become Christ followers? And then if they can identify 2 or 3 or 4 spiritual disciplines that they as a church are pursuing together, that can turn them into disciples of Jesus more fully than they currently are, I think that then opens the door for methodological innovation. We can do that in-person programmatic gatherings for those who are able, and that means something to them. We can do that online in a Zoom meeting with those who can do that. We can do that in a outdoor space with those. We can do that one-on-one. We can do that individually. There are lots of methods we can use to accomplish this. But if we can get some spiritual disciplines that we want to pursue for a period of time, maybe for January to June, let's pursue these 3 spiritual disciplines. The way we do it is highly negotiable, and it just depends on the needs. But so it's one way to gather us around things. Well, this has been a great.
Can I say one more thing
Jerry.
too, Mark? I think you're absolutely right. I'm hearing banging in my head the words of Glenn Henson, who said that the day that Baptists blew their chances at doing discipleship well was the day that they created an office for efficiency at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. So we created systems that were efficient delivery systems without ever considering whether they could be effective means for shaping and forming faith in the person of Jesus Christ for the sake of the world. So I say this for you, Mark, and for everybody else who is on here. It is so important as we are in this season of reflecting on what we're doing and how we're doing it and what God is really up to in the world, that we realize we have taken into ourselves this efficiency system, and we called it Sunday school or whatever we called it, because it categorized, it put people into small groups. It was easy. You have a delivery system for curriculum, whatever you want to call it. But I'll quote another of my good friends, Israel Galindo, who says that the null expectancy factor took over Sunday school a long time ago. Nobody is coming to Sunday school expecting to be transformed or changed or to become more like Jesus. The teacher is not expecting to be changed. The pupils are not expecting to be changed. In other words, every survey that we've done in Baptist life over the last 50 years has said people come for one reason, or at least primarily, to be with their friends. And that's not a bad thing. Community is good, but it needs to be purposeful community. So if that can release you in some ways to think differently about this delivery system and to be much more intentional about the faith-shaping potential of what it is you are doing, and connecting back to what Mark says, I think this is a season of opportunity, because we have the chance to move from a place where we can't see any other way to do it, to seeing that there are myriad ways getting at the task of discipleship.
Thank you, Terry. Wow. Let's make that a great summary statement for our time together. He wrapped a bunch of things together and I like that efficiency delivery system. Glenn Henson. I might use that. That's a great way to understand what has happened. Well, very stimulating conversation. Thank you, everybody. And Terry, am I right that next week on Thursday it's 2:00 in the afternoon?
Yes, from here on out, the next 3 weeks, and there is a separate Zoom link for the 3 consecutive weeks that happen at 2:00 in the afternoon. So we are most grateful that you spent this time with us. We thank you, Mark, for the stimulating conversation and the ways that you're helping to shape and form us so that we can turn and shape and form others to do this better and in a more excellent way. So blessings and peace on everybody, and we will see you next Thursday. Invite others to join us.